Hey folks, it's Michael with episode 10, I think it is, of the ccerp podcast, Cypress Creek Ecological Restoration Project. So, hope you've enjoyed the episode so far. There'll be all kinds of different content, as you've already seen. A lot more to come. But please feel free to share them with other folks. Like the podcast on our podcast host page and on your local app and all that, if you would. But today we're going to talk about water quality, and kind enough to join us is Justin Bauer. So Justin, will you say hi and tell folks about yourself, please?
Thanks, Michael. I'm excited to be here. Like I said, my name's Justin Bauer. I am with the Houston-Galveston Area Council. HGAC is the Regional Council of Governments. Essentially, we're sort of a regional government. We don't have any taxation or police power or anything like that. Mostly our role is to help local governments work on issues that are kind of bigger than any one jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. So things like, how do we plan our transportation routes? How do we improve our air quality, our water quality, our public services? We mostly serve as kind of a facilitation point, so we bring a lot of data and, technical expertise to the table, and but mostly what we do is get people around the table talking about these big issues and try and find kind of where there's areas of overlap. And one of the areas I work most on is water quality. We're a big region. We've got a lot of waterways. If you think about all the bayous that just run through Houston itself. And they've got a lot of water quality challenges. And those overlap with a lot of other challenges, which, I think are more prominent on people's minds, like the fact that we've got a big water quantity challenge. Flooding and resilience are really kind of, especially in Cypress Creek, at the forefront of everyone's head. So it's kind of a real excited time to be talking about a lot of these issues because There's so many things that are going on that are overlapping. So if you can't tell, I'm pretty excited to be here and talking about this stuff.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks. And you say it's the... Okay, I need a little more coffee. Some of this I'm not retaining, and some of these names. Did you say the Houston-Galveston Area Council? Did I get that right?
Yeah. And that's the organization that I work for. The partnership that we're working on with Cypress Creek is the Cypress Creek Watershed Partnership, and essentially that's the name we give to the collection of stakeholders that are working on water quality for Cypress Creek. Okay. So HGAC is helping to facilitate that project along with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, but it really is it's a locally led project. So it's not HGAC's project, it's not TCQ's project. Really, it really is the collection of all the local governments and residents and things like that. So when I say I'm from HGAC, I'm really here on behalf of the partnership.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, and that's how I found out about you, of course. Looking up water quality in the area and finding out about the Cypress Creek Watershed Partnership and so on and so forth, and things lead from there, One thing logically leads to another. So
we hope so.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
Yeah. So that's who you work for. What's your background in some of your education and some of your experience?
Sure. I'm not from Texas originally. I grew up in upstate New York.
As people say, I wasn't born here, but I got here as fast as I could.
Yeah. It's been kind of a long, winding road, literally in some cases. But I was born in upstate New York. I grew up near the Adirondack Mountains and the St. Lawrence River, and it was, we had quite a bit of land. So I grew up, with a very early appreciation of natural spaces, and it's one of those things. I kind of grew up with, nature wasn't a place that we went to. It wasn't like, a park. It was just kind of where we were. And I think that's really kind of been a fundamental shaping of my career. But I did my undergraduate work in New York, and then did a graduate degree in energy and environmental policy, focused on watersheds and water quality, and made my way down. My wife and I came down here for her job, but I was real excited to be working in an area where, water quality is a real challenge. We haven't figured everything out. And I'm a big outdoor kind of guy. And so this is completely new territory for me. We've been down here about 15 years now, so I think I'm kind of getting the ropes. Cool. But my background has been pretty varied. I've worked for a lot of local government sort of organizations. I've worked for private organizations. I've worked for regional organizations like HGAC, but generally in some sort of environmental management kind of capacity.
Oh, yeah, and so folks don't wonder, about the contradiction. I opened up an article so I could read Houston Galveston Area Council in words in front of my eyes to make sure I was remembering right. It's not like I remembered it.
It doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue.
Yeah, right. Cool. So how many acres did you have up there, and how many acres in general did you have to run around on?
We had what was considered for the area a pretty tiny parcel. We had about 200 acres.
Wow!
But it backed up to thousands of acres of
cool.
Forest and wetlands and marsh. It was a real interesting. It was a little isolated, but it was a real interesting kind of experience as a kid. A lot of the things that I do now, very specifically, like going bird watching or hiking and things like that. We didn't really think of those as separate activities. That was just sort of we knew the birds because they were there. It was just it was a sort of a different perspective, and I've tried to bring that perspective to my work in our more urban and suburban areas where we're facing some very different challenges, but that still kind of draw on some of those same concepts that even where I live in the energy corridor, or even in a lot of places I work in, nature is still, it's not something that we just drive to. It is around us. The natural systems that affect our water quality, that affect our life are there, even if they're not as obvious as it is, somewhere beautiful like the mountains.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. A couple points there, but on the nature thing, a lot of folks, because they get so carried away in their lives and working, and the social aspect of being human is so big and important.
Sure.
They forget about the fact that we're part of the natural world. And since people aren't out in it, it's not in education as much as it should be. And people think kids go to grocery stores to get food and this and that. And there's that detachment from your food and from nature, and the fact that society is in nature. Nature is not in society. It's like we live with its permission, not vice versa, And even though maybe some people know that to some extent, kind of, sort of, it's just not part of our conceptual machinery and our explicit, involved awareness of the world as it should be.
And part of that is, I think, human nature, but part of that is, again, why for me it's so exciting to be working on some of this stuff right now, is because we've just come through a time with Hurricane Harvey and some of these other large events where that artificial barrier, mental barrier we have between what is natural and what is human, is shattered.
Yeah, it's hey folks,
and I'm not trying to,
I'm here.
I'm not trying to make light of that. It was a very serious and tragic thing for a lot of people, but it really did kind of point out that, look, we can't have this traditional conception of, nature is over here and we're over here. We really need to understand how natural systems affect us and hopefully how natural systems can benefit us. But to understand that, we are intrinsically connected there, that there isn't, this barrier that we have in our heads is, part of human nature of how we sort things out, really isn't there in the real world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. It's interesting. And I had in regard to your upbringing, I had something kind of similar. I lived in Louisiana a bit when I was young, and then up in Pennsylvania. And it was suburban in Louisiana and kind of more suburban country in Pennsylvania, but nature was right there around us. It was like we lived up on a little hill, kind of figure four street that came out of the valley, and you've got your backyard, but it borders a bunch of woods on the hill, So you're in your backyard, you're pretty much in nature, you cross your boundary line and you're not in a big subdivision, or you're not somewhere where there's like all this private property where you're like constrained in, as a lot of it is around here in Houston. But, we'd run in the back and play, and there were underground streams and boulders left from the Ice Age, and we could see deer and rabbit in the backyard. And, it was great for a kid to like grow up in a place like that. So then when I came down here, it was kind of culture shock by comparison. It's like,
it is a little different.
Yeah. It's like subdivisions and not much to do, and swamps, and it's like, we can't go anywhere.
And, I think part of that just, it makes us, as we think about, what is the region going to look like moving forward? How do we, try to improve the resilience of our area, the water quality, et cetera? I think part of the thinking is, we need to understand, like I said, that these natural systems aren't separate and apart. And some of those things that you and I loved, growing up in a more natural area, we can build those, there's ways for development to incorporate some of that. And there's been, some great successful examples of that, but, we don't have to do things the way things have always been done. There are economically feasible, there are, environmentally sound ways to move forward that recognizes, hey, we're a super fast growing city and region. That's not going to change. And as much as I love, thinking back on my childhood, that sort of, hundreds and hundreds of acres is just not what the area is going to look like. Mm-hmm. So how do we, incorporate those demands of growth in a way that, also enhances that connection to nature, and also enhances all those benefits that we get from, things like wetlands and water and urban forests, and recognizing that it may not be what was natural, but that there's a value to that sort of new natural, that new nature, that using green infrastructure and things to enhance what has traditionally been a very, gray infrastructure oriented kind of development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's not a matter of having to either be all industrial over the entire world and concrete the whole thing, or give everything up and have it be quote unquote natural and us need to do anything. I think those are both false alternatives. The proper thing is having a proper concept of human nature and grasping that includes us being in an ecology. It's to live, we need a proper relationship with our environment and seeing what that environment actually is.
And I think a big piece of it, especially for us, is, trying to bridge that gap is, you and I can talk about things like the intrinsic value of nature and our experiences growing up and, the values we drew up there. But there are some very real economic values to these natural systems as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if I'm talking with stakeholders who maybe they didn't have the same experiences I had growing up, and maybe their values are slightly different than mine, mm-hmm. I don't need them to overlap with my values 100%. I need to find that where that overlap is and say, okay, I value urban forest for X, Y, and Z. They also produce value for you. That's, A, B, mm-hmm. and C. And somewhere there's an amount of overlap where we both are getting benefit out of having expanded urban forests. They're getting it for resilience or drought, or whatever the case may be. And I'm getting it for, other reasons, but there's a piece of overlap. And that's what we really try and focus on is find where there are connections, between groups who may be used to, shaking their fist at each other across the newspaper headlines. But there's always places where those values intersect. That's really the value point there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we all have some things that we might have some values or little things we might like that no one else or few other people do, but we're human. Everyone's a human being. We all want to live, so there's necessarily going to be this objective, scientific similarity and these similar values in all of us. It's like things we're all care about and are emotional about and passionate about.
Sure.
because it's our nature. We're the same, you know?
Yeah. I mean, not everyone's going to care that, that field out in the Katy Prairie is really good for winter sparrows. But everyone has a value in, avoided costs of downstream flood reduction infrastructure by potentially conserving that part of the Katy Prairie. There's, like I said, there's always that overlap.
Yeah, true. Or, some people, know more about ecology and the nature of things and, have dug into them and know that, okay, well, coyotes are important and here's a place where coyotes can be. But then there are some people who maybe, they hate coyotes. I think it's more a matter of ignorance, but if someone doesn't, then it's like, hey, here's a place where they can be. They don't got to be around you. So it's good for both of us.
Yeah, exactly.
I like coyotes. Exactly. They're here. You hate them. This place will let them stay away from you. We're both good.
Exactly. Provide an alternative.
Yeah. But what got you interested in environmental work in particular?
I really think it just stems from childhood on. I've always been outdoors. We would just go out and, with hundreds of acres, we would just go out and wander all day long. And, it's always been something that's important to me. I pretty much all the way down the line have just thought that was something that, hey, if I can get someone to pay me to spend some time walking around outside and, doing the things that are, really interesting to me, that's always been a big plus for me. And what I really like, kind of about my role is that, I'm really very much the, jack of all trades, master of none. I'm a part scientist, part, facilitator, part policy guy, part, technical model guy. I've got lots of bits and pieces, so I get to play in all these different fields, because, the things we're talking about, water quality and resilience, they cross over so many disciplines. And for us to look at any of this in one specific thing, like we're only looking at flood reduction or we're only looking at water quality, misses the bigger picture, misses how all this stuff connects with adjacent fields. There's some colleagues of mine from Texas A&M Forest Service. We've been talking for, the better part of a decade, because we were all doing work that was kind of adjacent. They were doing this forestry stuff over here. I was doing this water quality stuff over here. But we really didn't have as much connection between those fields as we wanted, as we saw that would be beneficial. Because there's great forestry practices that benefit water quality. There's great water quality programs and focuses that help bring attention to forestry issues. And that's really kind of been my focus and where I found my niche is looking for ways to bring these disparate fields together. And part of it, I think, is survival, because I'm not an expert. I'm not an urban forester. I'm not I have a little bit and piece of all this stuff. But I think it's important, especially when you're in an area like Houston, where there are so many overlapping interests and jurisdictions and things like that. You have to look and see what's going on that touches each other, even if it's not, traditionally in the same sphere.
Okay, that makes sense. I was going to ask, because you're interested in the outdoors, so why not be a nature guide or be an ecologist or a biologist? But what you just said pretty much answers the question I had. So yeah, you don't want to look at something narrowly. You like the big picture, and I get that totally. Some people want to narrow in on something, cool. But me, I'm like the same. I do detailed things, but I have a degree in philosophy for a reason. It's because it's very important to me, and I love the hell out of that. It's like the big picture, making connections. So yeah, I get that entirely, and I see the value of it and the work. 'Cause I know I couldn't do a lot of the stuff I do in teaching without knowing biology and something about art and something about philosophy and logic and math and physics and history. It's all comes together and helps me out and is very influential. But,
and I'm eternally grateful to have a parent who was a teacher, because I think she really instilled in me not only her love of nature, but the importance of having a curious mind.
Cool.
Of constantly getting, I have a dozen different hobbies I intermittently
Cool.
pick up and set down, just because I've always been someone who's constantly trying to foster that curiosity and explore new things, and sometimes it works well for me, sometimes it doesn't, but I think in terms of how that translates to my professional role and our role as HGAC has been a pretty good fit, because we really are looking at that big picture and how things connect.
Yeah. What are some of the hobbies you've had?
Oh, good gracious.
Weren't prepared for that. I didn't put that in the list of questions. Sorry.
I'm a bird watcher, wildlife enthusiast. I really like photography. I play a little guitar, not
Cool.
exceptionally well, but into things ranging from genealogy to woodwork to lots of outdoor stuff. I started off. I just had my first of the year hike. I start off every year with a hike just to start the year right.
How far?
Just a pretty broad range of stuff.
How far was the hike?
Oh, well, it was, talking about overlapping things. There's Audubon has a series of Christmas bird counts, of bird wildlife census that take place throughout sort of the Christmas period. And I actually lead one down in Brazos Bend, but I was sitting in with a friend on the Cypress Creek Christmas bird count,
Cool.
Which happens to be on January 1st. So I said that was going to be my first of the year hike. It was also going to be a great, wildlife and photography event. And it also was fantastic because a lot of people who were there and involved, people from organizations like Katy Prairie Conservancy and Harris County, are stakeholders on our Cypress Creek project. So there's, again, it should just show, keeps making that same point of, look, there's all these overlaps, there's all these conversations that are happening at the same time on all these adjacent issues, and they're all related. So for me, that was a real kind of zeitgeisty moment.
Cool.
It's like, am I here for work, or because I'm a birder, or because I really want to get a hike? I'm just wearing a lot of hats at once.
Huh. Yeah, nice. How far was the hike? Did you go like a mile or 10 or what?
Oh gosh, it was several. I can't remember what we ended up putting in, but it was several miles. We were out there for about 10 hours.
Cool. I know a running group that goes out there, and of course there's some bicyclers and CCMTB and the Wolf Pack, and yeah, they do some good distances out there in my area. But
yeah, it's nice to still have a little space to get around in.
Yeah. Yeah. Could be bigger, but it's better than nothing. It's a beautiful area. Glad we got it. What are some of the experiences you had when you were young? Like, do you remember any particular things about, I guess you don't have any snakes up there. Mainly it's some birds and some mammals.
Lots of mammals. That's the one thing I miss a little bit is some of the macrofauna. We'd regularly get a moose wandering through every year.
Wow, nice.
Black bear,
Cool.
lots of black bear. Some of the same stuff down here, coyotes and such. Lots of snakes. Not as many venomous snakes, so that was, I grew up in a place where, we didn't think twice about jumping into the little pond or, lake or whatever. It was significantly less that was going to harm or eat us. But, I remember vividly, we had a big bay window in our house, and I grew up in this turn of the 1800s old farmhouse. A big bay window that overlooked farm fields and stands of white birch. It was like a Wyeth painting. I mean, it was just beautiful.
Wow.
And nice. I remember that my mother kept these gigantic binoculars. I mean, looked like they came off a Russian submarine or something.
Like you could see Pluto with them or something.
You could see through time with these things. I mean, they were just massive. But I remember she would keep them on the ledge by that bay window, because inevitably there'd be a red-tailed hawk up circling over the farm fields, or there'd be birds at the feeder, or there'd be a coyote going across the fields, or a bear or a moose or something. And that was something we really looked forward to. We always, whenever somebody saw something, everyone would run to the window.
Cool.
It was a simpler time, but we'd all take lanterns with these gigantic binoculars. And we lived in a very old house. And
so would it be sometimes maybe be like 6 a.m. and everyone was watching the fuzz on TV before the TV station came on, and someone would say,
"Oh yeah,
look, bear!" Yeah, and everyone would run.
That definitely was prime entertainment in those hours.
I remember that. Watching
and we had an old railroad
white
bed that ran past our house.
Huh.
From where there used to be one of the old railroads, and it was mostly just a raised piece of earth. But it was fantastic because it was like our own private trail back through woods and marshes. And, I think there was a sense of ownership, even though only a piece of it was our land.
Mm-hmm.
I think it sort of instilled in me that kind of, I can go into this wilderness and this is, I'm part of this. This is connected to me, in a very real sense by this trail, but, also in that sort of more esoteric sense of, this is, again, like I said, not something that's away and apart from me. This is part of our experience here.
Yeah.
And I think that really kind of shaped, when you grow up in a place that has a sense of time and place to it. There was a book by, I'm going to forget it. I think the gentleman's last name is Kunstler, called The Geography of Nowhere, about some of the less beneficial aspects of our traditional suburban development. And part of what he was arguing is that we have a lack, in some places we have a lack of a sense of place. Everything looks the same, it's the same strip. It's like in old bad cartoons where the background just keeps repeating, while the character's running. Sometimes it feels like that when you're driving, down Highway 6 or something where you're just seeing the same strip mall, again and again and again. And that's not to speak poorly of Houston development or anything like that. It's just that, there is something about a sense of place. When I go to some of the smaller cities in our region or some of the cities in our outlying counties that are more traditional, it's a different experience. And so I think growing up in a place that had, 200 plus years of history, in a house that had 200 plus years of history, that is a different perspective, and it's a different way of looking and connecting to the world, because you're not just connecting to your immediate environment. You feel like you are part of a stream. It's not to use too many water metaphors, but you feel like you are you're connected to what has already gone before, and this place, very firmly rooted in this place.
Yeah, I think that's important. It's probably something a lot of people are missing nowadays. Like being part of nature is like having a sense of place and a sense of belonging and being kind of tied to that locality a bit, even if temporarily.
And exactly. And I think one of the things we try and key on is everyone has something that fills that place for them, that connection. And where we can find that overlap between, where my connection is and their connection is, that's where we can really get people's attention. That's where we can really get people focused on doing something, and potentially making a difference is, not just explaining someone on paper that, hey, bacteria levels are elevated and that means X, Y, Z, but really getting them on something that connects to them. Hey, that's the water where, when you were a kid that you used to recreate in, and do you remember those times, and is it valuable to you? Mm-hmm. And trying to find that place where you're not just explaining something to someone, you're reminding them of something they already know.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, we're going to take care of things more we love than things we don't care about or we think are expendable.
Sure, exactly.
So you saying growing up when you were a kid, like from your house, you could see black bear and moose?
Yeah, once in a while.
Cool. What about when you were out in the woods? Did you come across any in person there, or any rattlesnakes?
Once in all my time in New York, and I think this was down in the Finger Lakes in the western part of the state, I saw one timber rattlesnake, and that was only because it had been injured. I know they're there, just very, very rare to come across that. We saw lots of, Nerodia species, water snakes, garter snakes. There was old paving stones, big flat field stones that formed a walkway to our house, and there was one that went over a tree root and had a little crevice under it, and there was a garter snake that lived there all my childhood.
Wow.
That was the Snake Rock.
Wow.
So it was something. Again, it wasn't just something that we saw from a distance. It was just skunks wandered in and out of the property as well as our neighbors' cows.
Huh. Cool. Wow. Yeah, that's pretty neat. But cool. So, but yeah, fortunately, that stuff. Some of that people can still do around here along our creek. Get out, walk. Some people get out a lot and already know what's out there, but for folks who haven't, or if you live in a different area of town, I'd recommend you get out and get along the creek and enjoy and see what it's like, and maybe you'll want to become involved in preserving it and helping out with it, and helping preserve all the plants and animals that are out here. It's nice.
Exactly.
All kinds of different mammals and birds and trees and plants, and really interesting.
Yeah, Houston is an incredibly diverse area when it comes to flora and fauna. I mean, we're at the juncture. It's again, it's sort of symbolic. Houston is not only at the juncture of all these different types of ecosystems with prairie and pine forest and marshes and coastal areas, but it's also at the juncture of sort of the South and the West and a huge and thriving immigrant community. So there is as much diversity in our people as there is in our native environment, even if it's not as big and showy as mountains and pristine lakes. There's a very unique ecology and habitat of Houston, and Cypress Creek is a great example of that. There's so much change between the prairie headwaters and the downstream junction with the West Fork of San Jacinto. No matter where you live in the watershed, there's some place, some access point where you can get in and experience your local nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's nice. Cool. So we need to keep it clean, and so one thing you've done is get involved in the Cypress Creek Watershed Partnership, and how did that come about, and what does it do, and how'd you get involved?
Sure. Well, the short story is HGAC's been involved with Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the state regulatory agency for the state of Texas, on what's called the Clean Rivers Program for many, many decades. And the Clean Rivers Program is the way the state assesses the quality of its water bodies, which it's required to do by the Clean Water Act every couple of years. And so for this region, HGAC, along with several local partners, does well, and I apologize, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but well over 400 plus monitoring sites where we go out at least once a quarter, take a variety of water quality samples, and collect all that data over many, many years. And we submit that to Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and they use that to figure out, are our waterways meeting the standards they should be? If not, what are we going to do about it? And we did that for many, many, many years. And I think there was a lot of interest of, look, we're collecting all this information. What do we do with it? How do we take it from we know there's a problem to let's be part of the solution? And so our natural outgrowth was to get involved in some of the watershed-based planning efforts at the state level. And the one I work on is what are called watershed protection plans. And they're a little different than sort of the typical governmental approach to water quality. And this is not speaking poorly of regulation or anything like that. But I think sort of the perception, at least, of the typical approach is that, government comes in and says, okay, we've determined what the problem is. We've determined what's going to be done about it. It's now your burden to do it. And in some places, that's completely, what needs to happen. There are regulatory issues, that we could talk about that, are very much clean cut. Your factory is not meeting its effluent limits. It needs to do something. A lot of the issues we're dealing with now in water quality don't don't work as well in that traditional model. Back in the day, in the 60s and 70s, with the advent of the Clean Water Act and similar legislation, we had things like, the Cuyahoga River catching on fire. Rivers aren't supposed to catch on fire. Water is what you use to put fires out. It shouldn't be catching on fire. And the issue was, primarily, direct discharges from, factories and things like that. It was these nasty man-made chemicals. And, so as regulation has gone into place and we've dealt with what we call, the point sources, those very discrete sources of pollution, what we're really dealing with now is what we call non-point source pollution, which is essentially everything else. All of the accumulation of what happens on the land, all of our activities that washes in during rain events or is, discharged and that sort of thing, which, it's a lot, it's easy to go to a factory and say, well, we're going to control what comes out of that pipe. It's a lot harder when it's not one factory. It's 10,000 people with, 8,000 dogs. It's much more diffuse. And so the watershed protection plan process, and this was something EPA put into place some time ago, is it's a voluntary model and it's a locally led model. And the whole point is, sort of the reverse of that traditional approach is we get funding resources and we provide technical resources to come into an area that's got a water quality issue, work with the local stakeholders to really get the best understanding of where the sources of pollution are, not only where they are now, but maybe where they're going to be in the future. Are we seeing a decrease in livestock and an increase in suburban areas? Get a really good sense so that, when we start talking about solutions, we can target them wisely, that we're not just throwing money at a problem. We're saying, look, the biggest issue for bacteria in this watershed is feral hogs. We are going to specifically focus on that and not as much on anything else, or, whatever the mix is for that watershed. And the whole point is to get the stakeholders to make the decisions. So we're supporting the partnership, in this case, the Cypress Creek Watershed Partnership. We're supporting the local governments, the residents, the industry, the developers, everybody who takes part in this to work through this process to say, okay, we've done the background work, we've identified, where the sources are, kind of how much water quality improvement we need to meet water quality standards. The real messy is, okay, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to get from point A to point B? And work through and have the local stakeholders make some of those decisions. Okay, the city of Houston, for example, is going to be implementing new controls as part of its stormwater programs. We expect that to have a benefit. This neighborhood wants to put in pet waste stations. We expect that to have a benefit. And it really, the whole point of this watershed protection plan process is to serve as a roadmap. We don't want it to be a document that, sits on a shelf and collects dust and, well, that was a really great idea, but we didn't do anything about it. It's like a lot of reports are, Yeah. And I've written reports that turned into documents on shelves. Nobody likes to admit it. But the point of the watershed protection plan that we're developing for Cypress Creek is to be a living roadmap. It's, it identifies what we're going to do to improve water quality in Cypress Creek, how we're going to do it, to what extent, where the resources are going to come from, where we still have resource needs, who's going to be involved, the timelines, all those logistics. But the important thing is it's not written in stone. The whole point, like I said, is it's a living document. It's designed to be amended as we need it. We said we were going to do X, Y, and Z. Well, X worked great. Y and Z didn't work so great. Okay, we're going to swap out something else. So it's not as simple and clean cut as, we have a law and you're going to do this now, and if not, you're going to get fined. This is very much a consensus-based process. I have no regulatory power, nor do I really want any. My whole job is to do exactly what we were talking about before for Cypress Creek, is find where there's these overlapping values, find where there are partnership opportunities, and try and go out and find some resources to support the local stakeholders in putting these into place. At the end of the day, this watershed protection plan, this partnership, it's the property of the local stakeholders who take part in it. It's not, HGAC's project going forward. This is a local project. So, our big challenge is to get people engaged enough, involved enough in, the issues of water quality in Cypress Creek that they want to take these recommendations, they want to take this roadmap and implement it and go forward and do these things. And this model's been used for quite a few places now in Texas, some with greater success than others. Like I said, it's not regulatory, so there's no hammer there. I can't force anyone to do this, but what we really see the value in it is that it really does accent local control. It does accent that, look, something is going to be done about water quality in this waterway. This is an opportunity to step out in front of it, take the lead, shape it to what you think is most feasible for your communities, for your operations, and what, at the end of the day, the people who live in the communities of Cypress Creek are the ones who are going to be impacted by water quality on Cypress Creek and who are going to benefit from anything that's done to improve it. So that's what we're really trying to accent, to really foster that sense of local ownership, of local control, and to try, like we've been talking about connection to nature, to try and connect people to the value and impacts of water quality in Cypress Creek.
Yeah, I think that's a better idea, because if people value something and understand what's going on, then they have their own buy-in. It's and it's going to be sustainable, and they're going to continue. When we're forced to do something, being human, then we rebel.
Yeah, and there's certainly times when regulation is necessary.
Just like I like to say, discipline yourself, or someone will do it for you.
And unfortunately, like anything else, the vast majority of people who have businesses or deal with anything are doing what they should do, and it's the folks who are cutting corners who kind of ruin it for everybody else. But there are places where regulation is necessary. But what we're trying to do is bridge those areas where either regulation isn't there or isn't the most effective thing, and try and find a way that is more effective. And so far, we really think this voluntary watershed protection plan approach is really the most long-term effective way to address these things, because there isn't a regulatory hammer here for most of what we're talking about, but there is a real community impact, and there's a real value to the community to have clean water and all the things that go along with it. So, trying to bridge that gap between a lack of a mandate and very real community need is kind of why we've gone with this niche.
Mm-hmm. How long has the partnership been around? When was it formed?
So the partnership's only been around about a year now. Okay. We've been working with TCQ on this project for a little while longer. Typically what we'll do is prior to getting everyone around the table, we'll go do a lot of the background work. So there's a lot of, me sitting down at a computer and cranking through old water quality data and developing spatial maps. And because when we come in and talk to the stakeholders, we want to be able to answer questions, and we want to be able to guide them through the process to the best of our ability, to be able to say, hey, that's a great question about where these pollutant sources are in the watershed. Here's a map that shows that, or here's the data, so that when we're making decisions as a partnership, it's not just it's not intended to be a feel-good, let's all talk about something we already agree about. It really is designed to be, scientifically based, data-driven, so that when we go out and say to TCQ and EPA and others that, hey, here's what we think needs to happen with water quality, that, we have a backing for that. We say, look, this isn't just a feeling, this isn't just an anecdote. Here's our data, here's what it shows, we've done our homework, and hopefully, that leads to, okay, great, that opens up some funding sources so that the burden isn't just on the local community. And that's a piece of my job, is to not just develop these plans, but try and find the resources our communities need to put them into practice. But we're still at the developmental stage for Cypress Creek, so we're still working through. We've just finished doing a lot of our work in terms of understanding where the sources of contamination are on Cypress Creek, and we're at a real big milestone. I'm really excited Cool. Switching to, okay, we now understand the problem. What are we going to do about it? Where do we go from here? And that's the less obvious part of the process. The data we can tweak in different ways and different assumptions, but at the end of the day, the data is the data. What's unique to every watershed project we work on is, what are we going to do about it? What works best for the local communities? What is feasible? What is going to have an actual impact? And how do we assemble all those different interests together around a cohesive set of activities to move forward with?
What are some of the sources of like pollution and contamination in Cypress Creek?
Sure. So the primary things we're looking at are not some of the really nasty stuff like the man-made chemicals, PCBs and dioxins, and sort of industrial byproducts. Most of those are handled through regulatory processes or limits for plants. A lot of what we're looking at is what I said, is that non-point source pollution. The biggest issue we have in the Houston area is fecal waste. There's really no more polite way of saying that, there's too much poop in the water. And we measure that with a couple different bacteria. E. coli is the one we use in freshwater systems like Cypress Creek. But what we're really saying is there is a presence of fecal matter in that waterway, and it comes from all different sources. It comes from human sources, livestock, wildlife, and where that fecal matter is, we know that all the pathogens that are associated, all the things that can make us sick, are going to be as well. So E. coli is what we call an indicator bacteria. We're not necessarily concerned about E. coli itself, but where we see E. coli, because it's in the guts of pretty much all warm-blooded animals, where we see that bacteria in the water, we know there's fecal waste, and we know there's a potentially a health issue. Especially if you're in a third world country or developing a country where modern sanitation isn't as prevalent, you see a lot more waterborne disease like cholera and things like that. And a lot of that is linked to fecal waste in the water. And so that's why one of the big concerns under the Clean Water Act in terms of whether a waterway is, fishable, swimmable, essentially we're looking at, the contact recreation in that waterway, is the levels of fecal waste. How likely are you to get sick by going in that water? And so for a waterway like Cypress Creek, where people are in close contact with it, where there is recreation, where it does feed into a drinking water source with Lake Houston, that's a specific and very important focus for us because it does have the potential to impact a lot of folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's some motivation we need. The fact that it's going to come back to bite us, it's our drinking water going into Lake Houston. So it might flow away and it might just be flowing, but, the stuff from our faucets, as we all know, it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from somewhere.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it comes from the faucet, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so fecal waste, E. coli is our primary concern in Cypress Creek because Cypress Creek does have elevated levels of fecal waste.
How much higher is it than normal?
So it differs throughout the waterway.
Makes sense.
One of the reasons, and through the season, even through a day, there are places in the Greater Houston area where we see fecal levels, orders of magnitude higher than the standard. Cypress Creek, we don't see it quite that high. It is above the standard, but we think it's in a range. Our data shows it's in a range where a project like ours can have an impact. There's some places in Houston, the Ship Channel, other places where, you're kind of beyond the scope of a project like this, the level of remediation that needs to happen. But a lot of our waterways and fecal waste is the overwhelming majority of waterways in Houston, the Houston area, have a fecal waste issue. That is usually, and especially in Cypress Creek, it's an issue we can deal with. It's within the scope of a project like this, which is very important when we look and decide whether we're going to work on a project in a specific area. Is, do we think this is actually going to have an impact? We also look at some things like levels of nitrogen and phosphorus, and called nutrients, in the waterway, because where those are really elevated, you can get things like algal blooms, and which lowers the amount of oxygen in the water, which, impacts the aquatic life, and are, sort of indicators of the waterway being out of balance. So there's a lot of other constituents we look at, but that fecal waste is our primary concern, mostly because it's a human health impact.
Mm-hmm. So the creek there's no real factories along it. So it's pretty much like PCBs and lead and some other chemicals like that are pretty much a non-issue.
Well, I never say non-issue. We do live in an urban area. There are going to be background levels of dioxins simply because we burn hydrocarbons. We have lots of cars. We have lots of combustion. So all those man-made chemicals are going to be there. There are very few places in the Cypress Creek watershed where we're specifically concerned about those. Those are things we're typically a little more concerned about in areas like, the San Jacinto waste pits on the San Jacinto River and some of those heavy industrial corridor areas. Most of the development in Cypress Creek, historically and current, has been, agricultural, suburban, residential. And so the things that show up in the water tend to reflect that. That's not to say that those things can't be an issue. We would never say that, water is perfectly safe, even if it met water quality standards. Like where I grew up, the waterways were pretty wild and natural. But there's still certain times of year where, we took care swimming because they called it beaver fever. There's a natural load of fecal waste or other contaminants. It's an open system. Things function in it. It is what it is. But we usually talk about relative levels of risk. So our primary concern on Cypress Creek are the contaminants that we expect to be there based on what's going on in the watershed. And that's a big focus for our project, is we're not looking at just the creek or just the area right next to the creek. We're looking at that whole piece of land that drains to that waterway.
Yeah, so thankfully factories aren't too much of a problem. I know there will always be the awesome, benevolent people who really want to help us by dumping Roundup or something like that in the creek. They're just so kind, but they're rare, thank goodness. But so the main thing is the main thing would be like having dog waste in a yard, which runs into a gutter, which runs into drainage, which runs into the creek, something like that.
Exactly, and that's part of the the message we try to get out with our stakeholders, is that even if you're not directly on the creek, you're likely, if you're within the watershed area, what you do still matters. It still gets to the creek eventually. Even if you're walking your dog in a suburb and you don't pick up after your dog and that washes into the storm drain, that doesn't go to a wastewater treatment plant. That goes directly out to a waterway. Maybe a ditch. That ditch may go to a tributary. That tributary goes to Cypress Creek, but it's all connected.
And it's connected back to us too. That's a fascinating, interesting thing about environment, biology, ecology, that complexity involved in those interactions and those long causal chains. It's like, I'm all into that. That like presses my button. But that's cool. But what were you going to say? I think before I started talking.
I probably lost my train of thought at that point.
Cool. Yeah, that happens to me too. Lots of trains go off the tracks. But
exactly.
And so, there's always going to be some fecal matter and E. coli in water. It's natural. It's evolutionary, ecological. It's just a matter of getting what's ecologically appropriate in there.
Yeah, and that's why we, there's a state water quality standard for the amount of bacteria that's, can be in there. There's a threshold that was set by EPA. 8 illnesses per 1,000 is, not acceptable. 7 illnesses per 1,000 is. It's arbitrary to some extent, but what we're really talking about is increasing levels of risk. So whether, we think the standard should be here or here, we know that the farther we get away from that standard, the higher we get above that standard, the more risk we have. And so a lot of what we do is, we're never going to completely eliminate the risk of being in and around a waterway, especially a natural waterway that's impacted by us.
And it's still safer than driving on a freeway.
Yeah, but we want to reduce that risk. We want to bring it down as much as we can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so and that's one thing I think it's important for people to get. I mean, some already know, some just haven't thought about it yet, but it's not like get rid of all the E. coli because it's everywhere, just like tetanus.
Right.
There's tetanus in a lot of soil, so a lot of times it's not a problem. We're walking around, we're handling it. Our immune systems are fine. It doesn't get in a wound. It's not concentrated. No big deal. Or H. pylori, I think that's supposed to cause some ulcers. Mm-hmm. And it's not a matter of getting rid of all the H. pylori, kill it.
Of course not.
It's natural in our bodies. It's always there. It's just a matter of keeping it under ecological control. We can think of our bodies as an ecology also. And that one element of the ecology is to be kept under control and minimized and kept kind of in its place instead of becoming very populated and running out other bacteria and causing problems for us.
Exactly. And, a lot of our concern, human waste sources typically don't end up usually showing up as like the largest contributors in most watersheds. But they're often the ones that we're fairly concerned about because the stuff that's in our gut should be in our gut. It shouldn't be, it should be in the bottom reaches of our gut. It shouldn't be introduced into the top reaches of our gut because it disturbs that balance. Some of the pathogens we're, most worried about are the stuff coming from our waste. So, there's something very, very apt about that concept of system and balance. And that's why when we look at the water quality in somewhere like Cypress Creek, we're really looking at a system basis. We're not looking at just the waterway. Like I said, we're looking at all that land and all the processes that happen on that land as part of that overarching system because it all has some connection.
Mm-hmm. And so could like dog waste and maybe some cow manure be like composted or something and it'd be okay? Or does it a lot of the dog manure, dog poop just needs to be like thrown out or something?
Yeah, dog waste is tricky. Some of the dog waste tends to be pretty concentrated in terms of pathogens and bacteria. It's typically when you do composting in your yard and that sort of thing, they say, keep animal waste in general, but especially dog waste out of that compost.
Mm-hmm.
It's just there are facilities that do livestock waste composting or digest it for gas. There's lots of things, and a lot of traditionally a lot of livestock manure is used as fertilizer.
Mm-hmm.
Dog
animal.
waste, kind of the best thing to do is just keep it out of the system. One of the things we're always trying to balance is, one of the recommendations often in projects like this is, having more waste stations for pets. You go to the park, there's a station and people say, well, you're putting a bunch of plastic bags into the world and, increasing that in landfills. And yep, you're absolutely right. It's not an ideal
come
solution.
up with an alternative. Yeah. Instead of plastic bags, come up with something else.
Yeah, and it's one of those things we're always trying to find a better solution, but really the best solution for dog waste is to get it out of the natural system. We typically don't think too much about it. As me, this is my dog. It's one dog, big old watershed. What's the impact? But sort of the base assumption we use when we start talking about dogs is about 0.8 dogs per household, so a little less than one dog per household. Well, if you think of how many tens of thousands of households we have just in the Cypress Creek watershed, it's a huge number of dogs, and that waste adds up. At one point we looked just kind of back of the napkin about, for the city of Houston surrounding area, how much does that equate to? And it was about 52 dump truck loads of dog waste every day for Houston, which is a tremendous amount of waste. And this is what non-point source pollution is. It's not one big source. It's the accumulation of all these little inputs, which makes it challenging because when we start talking about solutions, I don't have to just convince one guy at one wastewater treatment plant. I've got to convince 10,000, dog owners that, they really should be picking up after their pet.
Yeah, it's interesting. It makes sense. What matters is not just the fact that it's manure, but the animal it comes from and their diet. So people use cow and horse manure for fertilizer, but we don't use dog manure. And the American Indians used to fish to fertilize some stuff, not dog manure, and they had dogs, And
part of it, I wish there was a better solution for dog manure because it does tend to be one of the leading sources of fecal waste in a lot of our waterways. Just because, we tend to walk our dogs on streets with, kind of almost direct connections to the waterway. There's a lot of them. They produce pretty concentrated waste in terms of the amount of pathogens. Unlike cats, where, cats are certainly, in ecological terms, an invasive species. They are, there's a huge number of them, but most of their waste is sequestered from, the waste stream, either inside or that sort of thing, where dog waste, most dog waste ends up outside. So, it's sometimes a hard sell to convince people that, look, this is an issue. I'm not here wagging my finger at you saying, you're a bad person for owning a dog, and I love dogs.
Yeah.
Especially
German
Shepherds.
Recognize German Shepherds are the
and try and mitigate.
One of the best. I love German Shepherds.
We have to recognize and mitigate that, look, this is causing an issue. How do we inform the public? How do we make resources available so that they can address those?
Yeah, and then learn about the consequences because we're not omniscient. If we automatically knew the consequences of everything we did, we wouldn't need an education.
Of course,
I'd have a different profession. But and then, of course, unfortunately, too much stress on physics and chemistry. They're very important. I love them. Love the hell out of the history of physics. But we need to be learning more biology and learn more about, instead of memorizing DNA stuff, learn more about real-world stuff that still teaches us how to think really well, and even better than DNA does, but learn more about animals and plants and tracing out consequences and seeing how, one thing leads to another, and feeding our dog to polluting our water, things like that.
Precisely.
It'd help us a lot more, make society better, make people more aware of important consequences. Because, do you ever do anything with DNA nowadays? Does it really matter?
Ironically enough, one of the big questions, we've asked with what we do with water quality is, when we try and figure out where sources of fecal waste are, we look at these bacteria, but we're really looking at just E. coli. It doesn't really tell us, when I take a water quality sample, I learn there's this many E. coli. It doesn't say this is from dogs or cats or people. There are processes in microbial risk assessment and, where we can actually look at the DNA components of those E. coli and say this came from a dog. This came from, or this came from human. This came from non-human animal. And that's a potentially a very valuable tool. It's unfortunately not as exact or efficient a science as we'd like it to be. But I think the point is, there is a scientific principle that is being put to applied use. That, we're not looking at just, well, that's very interesting from an academic sense, but this is how this connects to a real world problem. And that's a big piece of what we're trying to do with a lot of these projects is we're not just here to say, okay, here is this number on paper that says there's a water quality issue and et cetera, et cetera. We're trying to connect that to real world values, to real world, okay, this is impacting potentially your health. This is impacting your animal's health. This is impacting, the treatment costs for your community. Make that connection between, and I'll be the first person to say, we delve pretty far into the science, and some of it gets pretty dry. There's usually 1 or 2 meetings with the partnership where I apologize in advance and say, guys, we got to get through this. I want to make sure everyone understands the science here, but some of it's pretty dry. So my challenge is really to connect that science to what that really means for Cypress Creek.
Yeah.
And that's the big piece of this project, is to move past just there's a problem in the data to, okay, what does that mean? How does that help us get to where we want to be?
Yeah. And DNA in general is important for some people studying animals. You can look at the scat, differentiate one type of species from another if you need to, right, and certain animals from another, things like that. But and some other uses, of course, studying primitive people like ancient man. But in general, I think DNA is irrelevant for most people in most everyday lives, and there's much more important things we should be learning first and spending our time with that are far more consequential to our everyday lives than like DNA, which, very few people actually use in their everyday life. And,
Yeah. And as someone who struggled with many of the mathematical fields, I certainly see the value of practical learning as a balance with theoretical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm not knocking DNA, of course. It's important. But
I'll tell you, though, one of my favorite applications of DNA technology is how many of the apartment complexes we deal with now who allow pets have started to move toward DNA testing. So if a homeowner doesn't follow their rules about picking up after the pets, they have a sample on file for that pet.
Neat.
They'll test it and then pass those costs and a fine along to the owner. And again, I don't mean to sound like I'm being retaliatory to pet owners. I thought that was a very interesting, practical application of some, more kind of esoteric science.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of holding people accountable and being responsible. And like I said, if you're not going to discipline yourself and do something so simple as pick up manure, someone will discipline you for yourself instead, Just
but it's also a great example of, kind of exactly what we're getting at. There's no regulation that makes this apartment complex do this. They're doing this because there is a value to having a waste-free environment. It's more marketable.
Yeah.
There's something, there's an incentive for them there that doesn't rely on me guilting someone or them buying in 100% on my value system. And we can key in on that, and we can say, okay, this is the benefit to you, which is how we spend a lot of our time.
Yeah. Yeah, and then even that person themselves, if they realized it, if they would leave their, like one person is a dog, they go out, let's say the dog uses the restroom 5 times a day, it's not cleaned up, even if they're the only person in an apartment complex with 1,000 people, what is that place going to look like in 5 days and 5 months? Is that person who has a dog really going to want to walk around in a bunch of dog crap eventually? Like, I don't think so. I don't think even they want that,
Yeah. No, I understand that.
Yeah. But, so, and of course, you just test for E. coli, but there's other bacteria that animal waste produces in the creek that changes their levels, right?
Yeah, so the reason we test for E. coli is it's an indicator. No matter what animal we're dealing with, there will be E. coli. So it's an indicator that there's fecal waste. The level of pathogens in the fecal waste is going to differ, depending on what type of animal it is. There's been some work recently, Anna Gitter and some others over at A&M have done some work on looking at what's the actual risk of different types of waste. And some of the preliminary findings are, even though we in the water quality profession kind of treat bacteria as bacteria in terms of test results, this, like I said, the stuff that's coming out of us has a greater chance of making us sick. The stuff that's coming out of animals that are closely associated with us, like pets, is sort of the next step down. And then you eventually get to wildlife, which doesn't have as much contact and sharing of pathogens with humans. And it's not that there's no risk, but there's a different level of risk. So that 100 units of bacteria could have a different level of risk depending on where it's coming from. So some of the work we try and do so that our stakeholders are well informed is to not just look at, kind of where bacteria is coming from in the watershed, but what are the potential sources? Trying to estimate, here's the cattle numbers that we know are in the watershed, here's where we think they are in terms of which sub-watershed, here's where the wastewater treatment plant's on, here's where we've had sanitary sewer overflows, here's the best information we have on wildlife populations. So we can start to at least estimate, we think, maybe 60% is coming from dogs, or, 20% is coming from livestock, so that when we start targeting solutions, we're not spending a lot of time and money on, feral hogs if they're only a couple percent of the problem and they're hard to deal with. We want to spend the money where we're going to get the most impact because resources are finite. I don't have a checkbook. HGAC is not we don't have a taxing ability. We're funded primarily by grants and contributions from our member governments.
So if anybody knows Bill Gates, please Bill Gates Foundation, have him get in touch with Justin.
Thanks, Bill. But that's a piece of it. One of the great things, if you don't have finite resources, the silver lining of that cloud is it makes you be very smart and targeted.
True.
Or at least try to be very smart and targeted on how you put solutions into play. I can't write, $1 million checks every day. I deal on a much smaller scale, so I have to be careful about where I'm spending my money so that I get the most impact for those dollars.
And so in terms of the water quality and the E. coli and stuff, so the question everyone wants to know, can you drink the water?
Well, I have to make a big distinction between the water that's in the creek and the water that's coming out of your tap.
The water that's in the creek.
Yes, I would never recommend, no matter what waterway you're in, drinking the water in a natural system. That's not to say that you're immediately going to get sick no matter what. But, it is a natural system. Even beyond fecal waste, there's stuff in natural systems that can make you sick. So, especially, when you're in the water, there's simple things, to keep in mind. If you've got open cuts, maybe you shouldn't be getting in the water. If you're in an activity where you can ingest a lot of water, be careful about when you're going in the water. All the times when fecal waste and other things tend to be pretty high in the water, or especially after rain events. You think about it, everything's washing off the land into the water. If you're going swimming in times like those, your risk is probably going to be elevated. There's never going to be no risk in an open system. But, again, we're talking about levels of risk. And being smart about what's going on in that whole watershed and how you approach the water matters. And, one of the big things that's usually recommendations, if you got open cuts and wounds and things like that, that's not a time to be in contact with water that may have, may be able to use that as a vector to get right into your body.
Mm-hmm. And again, that part of that is the status of your immune system and health.
Yes.
Even if it's a small cut, some folks want to avoid the water all the time because they have a compromised immune system. Some folks,
exactly,
you're more resilient, have a stronger system. If you have a cut, you can deal with it. But just like there's also flesh-eating bacteria pretty much everywhere too. Well, not so much everywhere, but it's a lot more widespread than some people think. And you can go in the water and swim at a beach and it's no problem, but it's just that when some people have a compromised immune system, say maybe a bad case of diabetes that's affecting them or something, that's when the flesh-eating bacteria can actually eat the flesh instead of just get inside and be controlled by your immune system.
Yeah, and there is some level of luck involved, and like I said, in any water system, even in a healthy person with no, direct vectors, you can just be in that wrong place at the wrong time, and get the amoebic organism up your nose with some water and, have some real issues.
Yeah, that's happened to some people in Texas. I don't know if folks know, but you can look it up. Some kids were swimming in some lake, and they've swam there before. It's just fine. Normally you can, but something happens and they pull water through their nose, and it's just that same thing. And you got some nerve going from the brain to the nose, and some of these bacteria or whatever get attached to that. And by the time you find out that something's wrong, it's too late,
And, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to scare people away from the water. Our bayous and our lakes and creeks, they're a fantastic venue for recreation. We may not be as obvious a place for natural recreation as, mountains and places like that. But we have a very active paddling community. We have a very active fishing community. Our bayous should be a focus of us getting out in our community and experiencing nature. It really just comes down to, improving your odds, going at times when you'd expect the water quality issues to be the lowest, taking, personal responsibility to, know your body and know what shape you're in and whether you should be getting in water that may have contaminants. But I certainly don't want people to not enjoy the water. I've gone paddling on Cypress Creek. I love getting in Cypress Creek. It's just a matter of, improving your odds to the best you can. And we're working in the background to try and make that less of a burden.
Yeah, then the rate from being injured or dying in the water is way less than the homicide rate or the deaths from traffic accidents. So if someone really wants to be safe, they need to get in the water and avoid crowds and criminals and traffic.
Well, I tell you what, there's a lot of people trying to improve a lot of different things in Houston. I'm only going to deal with the water.
True.
We certainly are working on traffic as well. But you're right. There's risk to everyday life.
Or salmonella in eggs or cantaloupe.
Yeah, and especially. We try and put these things into perspective. We're not here to scare people into not going in the water. We're just trying to make that margin less of an issue, so that we can be more assured that when we get in our local waterways and we enjoy, these natural resources in our community, that we have less of a chance of getting ill because of it. It's not to say that's the most important thing going on. Obviously we're having this water quality conversation. At the same time, there's much larger water quantity conversations. But it's, I think of it as sort of the many players, same team concept. There's lots of issues. There's lots of challenges we have as a city and region. This is one of them. There are others. We're all on the same team. We all try and coordinate and help each other, especially, with the things we deal with at HCAC.
We have to. There's so much. It's impossible otherwise.
Yeah, but it's not a choice of this or that. These are all things that are happening concurrently.
Yeah, that's ecology. It's like all kinds of different parts that have to work together. It's like you can't do one alone. And so don't drink the water in Cypress Creek. Don't rinse out your mouth with it. What about letting dogs or horses drink from it? Do you think it's... depending on the animal, and certainly I don't want to give folks advice for their animals that may lead to cause. So this is disclaimer first. This is not medical or veterinarian advice. Please consult your doctor.
This man is not a doctor. Do not trust a thing he says about.
This is just scientific information.
We typically see less incidence of disease for animals in natural systems. But again, it's a hard thing because a lot of things we're talking about are gastrointestinal illnesses. And a lot of the information we have, a lot of the epidemiological data we have based on, our ability to report symptoms and to connect those to, we were in the water. Animals can't do that very well. We can't ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, how's the pain? So I think there's some uncertainty there. I certainly wouldn't hesitate to let my horse or something drink from a natural waterway in general. Again, though, if you're looking at very turbid water, after a rain event, you don't know what else is washing into that waterway, it may be a better time to look for an alternative water source. And we talk about that with agricultural producers. There's a lot of great existing programs through A&M AgriLife and Texas State Soil Water Conservation Board and other partners to help producers improve their operations by doing things like alternative water sources, so that their cattle aren't risking injury or disease by going down to a creek, which also benefits water quality. And that's kind of a real good example of the approach we try and take with a lot of our water quality projects. Is we're not here to point a finger at someone and to lay blame. We're here to say, okay, you've got interest, we have an interest. Where do those interests overlap? If I can get a water quality benefit and help you with your agricultural production at the same time, fantastic. You don't need to buy into water quality as being important, because you still get a benefit. So anytime we can find that multiple benefit, that's really what we're trying to emphasize.
Yeah. And so, kind of go back on that, so it might be okay for more dogs and horses to drink, but still, it is a water quality issue. Water quality is an issue for them as well. We need to think about all the folks that have dogs along the creek, and a lot of people go to waterways. The dogs like to run in them. So for ourselves, for the dogs and horses we love, to help out other people, be considerate. We should keep the water clean, cleaner than it is.
Definitely.
And then we should be considerate for all the animals and plants that live in the area. Like, if people go to the creek more and learn more about it, probably a lot of people just think, well, it's just like people think sleep is just where you lie there. A lot of people haven't learned, and studied what scientists have to say about how important it is and what's really going on. But same thing with the creeks. It's not just like water flowing through a pipe. It's like this organic ecological system. And we have fish and mussels and clams, river mussels and clams in there, and otter and beaver and nutria and water birds and deer going to drink. So insofar as we know the value of that to ourselves, not just aesthetic, but how we need a good ecology to survive and thrive, then we should take care of the water for that also. Because it's like,
oh, of course, there's always a hierarchy of interests. When we're talking to a broad array of stakeholders, the one thing that most people key on is what values we as humans draw from the waterway or are impacted by waterway. But there are definitely things beyond us that matter as well. The fully functioning aquatic ecology is important in its own right, regardless of whether we draw an economic benefit from that. And that's one of the things that is sometimes a challenge when we deal with some of the constituents we talk about in water quality, because there's some things that they impact aquatic life, but is there really an impact on us? Maybe not. Unlike a public health issue like fecal waste. But part of the argument we make is, look, there are values that we derive, whether they're direct economic values or whether it's simply having aesthetics and a sense of place and a sort of community we want to live in, that rely on functioning natural systems. So even if we're talking about things as sort of intrinsic values and the value of to wildlife and simply the natural system, there's still a connection for us, even if there's not a direct benefit. And that's what we try and bridge that gap with folks, is that I don't need you to believe that there's a value of that species of fish continuing and surviving and having the habitat it needs, but I can connect that to things you do value.
Yeah.
And hopefully get you to broaden your understanding and see that these things are connected, and then that there's an importance there, even if it's not a direct value to you.
And what about eating fish that you catch in Cypress Creek? Are they okay, or would they have?
Yeah, and I go to that, that kind of cop-out stock answer of, we are in an urban area. This is not a beautiful trout stream in southern Pennsylvania or something. This is an area that does have industry. Fish do migrate back and forth in waterways. One of the things you can do to cut down your risk is to cut away the fatty tissues in fish, especially in predator fish, higher up the food chain, trout and things like that eat other fish. Because some of the really nasty stuff that we're worried about, the PCBs and dioxins tend to accumulate in those fatty tissues. And the further you go up the food chain, the more they accumulate. So when you get some of those higher level species, you've gotten a lot of this contaminant accumulated. So avoiding some of those higher species, paying attention to the Department of State Health Services issues fish advisories for different waterways. That can give you an idea of, hey, there's some fish maybe I shouldn't be eating, or I should be taking great care in eating or limiting my consumption of for these waterways. In Cypress Creek, it's not like some of the areas around Galveston Bay where there's been historically, large industrial presence. A lot of the fish that we have in Cypress Creek, are reasonably safe to eat. There's always going to be potential risk of natural pathogens and that sort of thing. But we don't typically worry about fecal waste contamination with fish the same way we do with some of the man-made constituents.
Okay. I don't fish in there, but I've come across a lot of people who do. I mean, not a lot, but I've come across some people now and then, and I've always been concerned as to whether the fish is safe to eat, but and I've passed on some caveats. Maybe they want to look up the water quality, but I'll be able to be a little more informed next time I say something to someone. That's good.
Yeah, the two best recommendations are just make sure it's cooked thoroughly and cut away as much of the fatty tissue as you can, because that's where a lot of contaminants that accumulate in fish are going to live.
Yeah, because I know someone who said that, one guy I talked to said he's been eating fish out of there for a long time and has never had a problem. But, sometimes they just don't think they have a problem, because sometimes, some vet that works with cats, she has a great thing on her website talking about, every cat is healthy until all of a sudden they have a liver problem, or all of a sudden they have this, but it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's been a long process to get there. So I didn't know if maybe there's some kind of contaminant being built up in someone. So it's good to know that it's unlikely. And then I can.
I have less reason to think that there's an issue with fish in Cypress Creek than I may in some of the more industrial waterways.
Cool.
To the east.
Good. And what's that department that puts out the advisories about fish? What'd you say? Department of what?
State Health Services.
Okay. I'll put a link in the show notes to that. And is there a name for the thing they put out? Like fish advisory or water advisory?
I have it linked on my site. And I apologize. I can't recall showing, unfortunately, it caught me in a moment of ignorance. I can't recall to what extent of the waterways in the area they do that. I know they do it for a lot of the tidal waterways, the coastal areas. I'm not sure if they get up into the freshwater systems or not.
But hey, that's if you citizen science project right there. We can if people want, we can start having a group of people who monitors that and keeps us informed,
Yeah, and we certainly, one of the things we do in general, but we're especially interested in our watershed areas is HCAC is one of the regional coordinators for Texas Stream Team, which is a volunteer monitoring group. So, I said we go out to, several hundred sites throughout the region and monitor the water quality quarterly. We can't possibly cover all the ground in the area. We just have too many waterways and not enough resources. And time and people. So we have a wonderful group of volunteers, and essentially what they do is they adopt a waterway or a part of a waterway. They go to one site monthly. They take a series of simpler water quality analyses, and they report that data back to us. And what that does is it serves as sort of reconnaissance for us to all those areas that we may not have regular eyes on. If we start seeing something in their notes or in their results that looks kind of odd, we can go in and try and support them. And for them, and not only that, it's a great outreach activity. It's that person is, then an ambassador to their friends and neighbors and colleagues about the importance of water quality. And we've engendered that sort of sense of ownership of, it's like adopt a spot on the highway.
Cool.
They're taking care of that part of the waterway.
Cool. Interesting. Well, let me see. You better wrap up a little bit. I got another podcast interview to do in 25 minutes. So I want a little
all right. Sorry,
break
I've
in between.
Rambled on.
It's good rambling. It's sometimes you get outdoors and rambling is the best thing to do. That's when you learn and see new things,
Precisely.
But you got any last words for folks?
The one thing I would say is, if you're interested in this stuff, feel free to give me a call. But especially if you're in Cypress Creek, you don't have to be a water chemist. You don't have to be, a member of local government to get involved in this project. Some of my favorite stakeholders are folks who live in the communities along Cypress Creek who are just interested in their water quality and, have said, hey, I'd like to be part of the process. There's no commitment. You can show up for a meeting. You can send me comments. But we'd welcome them to get involved. Our website is www.ccerppodcast.com. It includes information. We have a meeting coming up in a week or so. We'd love to have folks show up.
Cool.
But like I said, I'm always happy to talk to people. I spend a good part of my day fielding phone calls from residents and folks who are interested in their water quality. And we'd be happy to share with them some of the resources we have to keep themselves informed.
Cool. And so folks know today's January 7th, 2020. So if you listen to this in July 2020 or August 2030, there will not be a meeting in a week that we're up. So, but
we'll try and schedule a meeting anyway. So no matter when it airs, we'll have something on the books.
Cool. But yeah, we'll post that in the show notes, and we'll touch base to see what other information you have that for folks we could put in the show notes. But yeah, clean water is important. I think because it's our own drinking water, because the dogs that we have and our friends and families, some of those dogs swim or run around in the water, and horses, and you got the wildlife, you got people walking in it, fishing in it. Some folks I've seen swimming in it. People want to canoe and kayak down it. So for all those different reasons and more, for our ecology, the cleaner we make it ecologically appropriately, the better, because we don't want it pure, pristine, distilled water, because that'll just kill everything, and it will become mixed with stuff anyway. So we don't want it too clean, ecologically appropriate, but cool.
Yeah.
So awesome. Thanks, Justin. That was an interesting conversation. I wish we could do more, but yeah, as I say, I'd like to continue another hour, but I gotta get ready for someone else.
That's okay. Cool. I really appreciated the chance to talk with you, Michael. And I'd be happy to, like I said, to talk with anyone else or follow up and get people more involved.
Cool. Be good to have another conversation. Awesome. But all right. So hope you enjoyed this, folks, and we'll have stuff in the show notes for you. More episodes coming up. Thanks for listening. Any questions, let us know. Contact information in the show notes. We'll talk to you soon, but in the meantime, get out, enjoy the outdoors, enjoy the Cypress Creek, take care of it, steward it, keep it clean, keep it beautiful. Thanks, guys. Bye.